Excellent. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Welcome. Good evening. I'm Melinda Jarrett, and I'm the Executive Director of the Fredericton Region Museum. I'd like to welcome everyone to our inaugural virtual presentation in the York-Sunbury Historical Society series. This is a first for us, so bear with us as we work out all the technical details. Let's begin the program. I'm going to ask retired Major Hal Scarrop to introduce our speaker tonight.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to something really interesting, a jump through time. Most of you probably participated in some event yesterday with the Remembrance Day services. Many of you probably are well aware that your family members that took part in the campaigns during the Second World War and since then remember it very well. I've not seen such an outpouring of respect and honor as I have even in my own home area up towards Woodstock Centerville Way. I want you to cast your minds back to a terrible time. Canadians are fighting in Italy. The war has been going on for a few years already, and it's now December 1943. The men who fought there called it Bloody December. It was called that by the soldiers of the 1st Canadian Division fighting on Italy's Adriatic front. It was a hard slog, marked with terrible weather, tough resistance from retreating German army, and a lot of casualties. One particularly difficult objective for the Canadians was a 70+ foot deep by more than 900 feet wide ravine that provided the Germans with a virtually impregnable defensive position. They'd been there long enough to know where we were liable to attack, when we were liable to attack, how we were liable to attack, and to develop systems to defeat that. And that's what made it difficult. This ravine came to be known simply as the Gully. Regimental historian of the Royal New Brunswick Regiment, Captain David Hughes, will outline the role, the triumphs, the tragedies of the New Brunswick's own Carleton York Regiment at the Battle of the Gully. And to do that, I would like to tell you a little bit of something about him. My own initial meeting with Dave was way back in the day when one of the guys I worked with got called away, and so my boss leaned in and said, "Have you got a sword?" And I said, "Well, yeah." And he said, "I'm going to hook you up with a warrant officer by the name of Hughes, and you two are going to take the freedom of the city." And I'm looking at him, really? Well, we did, didn't we? That was a ways back. Dave was born in London, Ontario in 1965. He grew up traveling back and forth between Canada and the UK and eventually settled in Blenheim, Ontario. He's keen on all things military from a young age. He joined the Primary Reserve in June '83 and served with the Essex and Kent Scottish in Chatham, Ontario. At that time, Corporal Hughes enjoyed the military life so much that he joined the regular force in 1985. Why do we do that? We just do. We just do. He served with the RCR, a very proud unit. We have them here in Gagetown, and if you see them, you know why a person takes pride in serving with them. Now, during his time with the Royal Canadian Regiment, he served in various operational deployments, including Op Unique in Goose Bay, Newfoundland, Op Salon in Ganawaki in Quebec, Op Snow Goose in Cyprus, we will cross paths there at some point, Op Cavalier in Croatia, Macedonia, and Bosnia, Op Recuperation in Eastern Ontario, Op Parapet 2 in the UK, and Op Athena in Afghanistan, where we again cross paths. During his time in 2RCR, David had the privilege of being appointed as the drum major of 2RCR Pipes and Drums. In this role, he led the band on many national and international events, including performing at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. in the USA. In 2006, Warrant Officer Hughes left the regular force and transferred to the reserves, serving with the 1st Battalion, Royal New Brunswick Regiment. In 2012, by now a Master Warrant Officer, he was a Company Sergeant Major of B Company 1 RMBR. He was commissioned from the ranks to the rank of Captain. The same year, he was appointed as a Regimental Historian of the Royal New Brunswick Regiment and as a voluntary secondary duty. He immediately organized the regiment's participation in the War of 1812 bicentenary. In 2013, he deployed on Op Nanook in the Northwest Territories as Company 2IC of the Arctic Response Company Group, and from 2013 to present, he has held various full-time Class B positions in the Canadian Forces, while continuing his volunteer work as Regimental Historian of the RMBR. This is a role which now includes managing the regiment's various social media platforms, including this one you're taking part in tonight. Captain Hughes has been married to Geraldine Maserville for over 28 years, and that's an accomplishment. They have two beautiful daughters, Sarah, age 14, and Emma, age 12, and he's a lifelong student of military history. He's a still serving veteran of the Canadian Forces and has been for over 37 years, and he's passionate about the long and proud history of the Royal New Brunswick Regiment. Please welcome Captain David Hughes. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Hal. Thank you for that kind introduction. We'll kick right off. I'm going to put up my slideshow here. All right, so we'll kick right off. So first of all, I should mention the importance of the Battle of the Gully to the Carleton and York regiments specifically is because that battle marked a real change in the intensity in the fighting that they had experienced up to this point in the Sicilian and Italian campaigns. The Gully battle proved to be a really tough nut to crack. That objective was specifically very hard. And the other circumstances, as I'll outline here in the presentation, kind of all swirled together to become something of a perfect storm to provide a really rough few days for the Carleton and York. So like any good military presentation, I have my outline of what we're going to cover here tonight. So we're going to talk about the ground that they had to go through, the enemy forces, friendly forces, the initial moves that took place prior to the Battle of the Gully itself, the events of 13 and 14 December, the events of the 15 December, and then finally the events from the 16th through to Christmas Day, 1943. And I'll end everything off with the connections with the regiment today and the Battle of the Gully. So first off, the topography of Italy certainly lends itself to give the advantage to a defender. As you know, the Allies and the Canadian Corps with them had to go up from south, up north, up the boot of Italy. And you can see by the topography of the map here what an incredible hard task that was. It's been said in the Italian campaign, behind every ridge, there was another river. And behind every river, there was another ridge. And the Germans certainly used the topography of Italy to their full advantage in defending it and their slow withdraw up the Italian boot. So by November 43, 1st Canadian Division had been moved to the Adriatic front, so on the east coast of the Italian boot. And we're starting to break through the German defensive line known as the Gothic Line. The next objective being the town of Ortona. Prior to being able to get to Ortona, they had to get through the German defenses along the line formed by the Moro River and the Ortona Road, which ran basically west to east across the entrances to Ortona. The Gully, basically a large ravine, formed something of a perfect defensive position for the Germans. It is what's known as a reverse slope position. Now, I've done a bit of a slide here with kind of a cross section of that area of ground, and you'll see what a good defense position it was. Before we get to that, though, you'll see the picture on the right that was taken in 2016. That's looking across the gully as it existed there in 2016. Pretty much the same as it would have been in 1943. Overgrown with vines, scrub along the bottom edge of the gully. Also, at that time in 43, heavily laid with mines, anti-personnel mines, which we'll get to here shortly, and covered by German fire. On the top of that picture on the right, you can see some buildings in the background there, just to the left of the picture. That is in the area of what became known as Cider Crossroads. It was a key objective. That crossroads was a key objective prior to being able to take the town of Ortona. To get to Cider Crossroads, the Carleton York had to go through the gully. So here's the cross section I was talking about. So again, like taking a cross section of the ground, the gully area provided the Germans with a virtually perfect reverse slope position. It made their positions virtually, impregnable to enemy artillery fire because their actual positions on the ground were out of observation of the Canadian forward observers. It gave them observation because they had observation posts both forward and behind the gully area and could see, had a clear view of any enemy approaching their positions. Additionally, to get through the gully, like I mentioned, it was heavily mined and certainly covered with fire. Next, we'll talk about the enemy forces they faced. Initially, on their first attacks of the gully, which we'll see as I get through the presentation here, initially they went against units of the 90th Panzer Grenadier Division. This division had formerly been a light infantry division that was part of the Africa Corps. Their badge shows an outline of the island of Sardinia, which is the area where they were reconstituted after North Africa fell, and they were made into what became the 90th Panzer Grenadier Division. Units of the 90th Panzer Grenadiers that were initially defending the gully. Later on in the battle, as we'll see, they faced the hardened 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, okay, paratroopers, German paratroopers. Now, to say they were a tough nut, I mean, they certainly were. That's an understatement. You know, they were combat hardened. They were replacing a unit that had just basically been reconstituted quickly after the fall of North Africa. And if the Carleton York faced tough resistance from the 90th Panzer Grenadiers, they faced even tougher resistance from the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division. Just some photographs there of the troops that the Carleton York were facing in this battle. As I said earlier, the area was heavily mined. Throughout the Italian campaign, the Germans had become masters at defensive and delaying tactics, and they made full use of their wide array of mines. These are just two of the types of anti-personnel mines they used. The German shoe mine, which was mostly made out of wood. Okay, there were some metal parts, obviously, but it made it very difficult to detect with mine detectors. This caused a lot of casualties. The one on the right is a German glass mine, and as the name suggests, it's made out of glass, so unable to be detected by the mine detectors that the Allies were using. This is a picture of a German Teller mine, an anti-tank mine. Again, heavily used. The Germans made great use of their minefields, and the topography of the ground in Italy made it, everything was kind of fully in their advantage. Excuse me. There's an interesting one here. This didn't really come into play so much in the Battle of the Gully, but like I said, the Germans had become masters in delaying tactics. And a not well-known thing that they did here is an image here from a book called The Road to Ortona. It's a graphic novel about the 1st Canadian Division's advance towards Ortona and the Battle of Ortona itself. So you can see in the picture, there's a rabbit and there's a German machine gun there, an MG-42. So one of the delaying tactics that the Germans would use they would get at times up to maybe 6 machine guns, where they would abandon the gun, leave one man on the gun, and as the Canadians approached, they would have a rabbit either tied or wired to the trigger of the machine gun. They'd have the rabbit in a sack. And then when it came time to withdraw, that one soldier that was left behind to let the rabbit out of the sack would let the rabbit go. The rabbit would run. It would cause the machine gun to fire. The rabbit would become scared and exhausted and just freeze. And then when it got its breath back, it would run again and fire the gun again. Now, on a frontage of maybe 6 machine guns that the Canadians were facing, that would cause them to have to deploy maybe a battalion or more to take out those positions. And it caused a big delay and gave the Germans plenty of time to withdraw up the Italian boot. Kind of an ingenious tactic, really. Friendly forces. Okay, you see here, this is just what we call an ORBAT, or Order of Battle of the 1st Canadian Division. I've circled the Carleton, New York Regiment there. The numbers that you see on the image, those are the numbers that each unit was assigned. It was their TAC sign or their kind of tactical control number. So any vehicles, for example, belonging to the Carleton, New York, will be marked with a 68 in those colors. And any like signage of they needed them to go on a certain route or a certain area to be marked with 68. So you'll see in this picture that the Carleton, New York Regiment was part of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Brigade. The other infantry units in that brigade with them was the Royal 22nd Regiment, the Van Duze, and the West Nova Scotia Regiment. The man in charge of the 1st Canadian Division at this time was Major General Chris Vokes. Now, primarily because of the events around the Battle of the Gully, he took a lot of criticism. And he actually ended up picking up the nickname amongst the troops as the Butcher. He was criticized for his use of sending in 1 battalion at a time initially to the battle of the Gully, where each battalion would get chewed up piecemeal, like one after the other. And that certainly happened in the Carleton, New York. Some people wrote about Chris Vokes that because of the nature of the ground in the Gully and the wet weather they had and the frontal tactics that he was using, feeding 1 battalion at a time into the German machine guns, it was very much similar to the First World War tactics. He took a lot of criticism for that from the soldiers that he commanded, certainly, picking up the name of the Butcher. And he also took criticism from his boss, General Montgomery, because the tactics he was using was creating delays in itself. It made things slow, 1 battalion at a time. They'd have little success, and another battalion would have to go in. It was taking too long for Montgomery's liking. So, like I said earlier, there was a lot of factors that kind of played into the perfect storm for the Carleton, New York Regiment to have a tough time at the Battle of the Gully, and the tactics used by Major Chris Vokes certainly played into that. Initial moves prior to the battle. On 8 December, the Carleton, New York Regiment left the area of Rocca, moved towards the town of the village of Treglio. 10 December, they moved to Saint Apollinaire. Now you have to remember at this point, the 1st and 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigades were in the lead. 3rd Infantry Brigade, or 3CIB as they came to be known, was in reserve. So ahead of the Carleton, New York Regiment and the rest of the 3rd Brigade were 2 other Canadian brigades at this point, and they were the first ones to engage objectives towards Ortona. 11 December, the Carleton, New York Regiment moved to a forming up point, getting ready to get launched into the battle north of San Leonardo. On the 12th of December, while they were in the forming up point, there was 2 unfortunate casualties. One was J.A. McKinnon, was killed by artillery fire, and another one, Furlong, was killed in an accident while he was handling a German captured weapon. Those two guys were the first two casualties of the Battle of the Gully. So, on the 13th of December, they leave their forming up point and move towards the start line for the battle. The first attack went in at 0600 hours. And they attempted to cross the gully, moving towards their objective area of Cider Crossroads. A and D Company were leading. It was too cloudy for air support, so they went in there with no air support. Additionally, the preceding artillery barrage had failed to neutralize the enemy position. As I mentioned earlier, they were in a very well-sighted reverse flow position. So the artillery barrage had very little effect on the Germans in the gully. Even though they suffered heavy casualties, as we'll see here shortly, there were some successes on that first attack. They took out several German machine gun nests on their fight through the gully position. Additionally, they captured 21 Germans as prisoner. There was a second attack went in, 1200 hours. Also, unfortunately, with little success. On the second attack, they suffered more losses in the form of 28 Carleton, New York soldiers being taken prisoner. One of their platoons, number 16 platoon, got cut off. Another platoon went in to try to fight their way through, give them a route out. And from that platoon, there was 28 soldiers taken prisoner. So on the first attacks on the 13th, the two attacks on the 13th, the toll of the battle was as follows. As you see there on the slide, 2 officers killed, 13 other ranks killed, 7 ORs died from wounds, another 33 ORs wounded. So heavy casualties, in addition to the 28 prisoners that were taken, as I mentioned. So as you can see, and I mentioned at the start of the presentation, the gully marked a big change and an increase in the intensity in the fighting for the Carleton New York Regiment. And compared to the battles that they have fought through up to this point in Italy and earlier in Sicily, they took a real beating here right off the bat on the 13th. On the 14th, once again, General Vokes decided it was going to be the Carleton New York's turn to try it again, another frontal attack. This time, less casualties, but once again, very little success. They were not able to get through the gully objective. This slide is just a picture of the headstones of the soldiers that were killed from the Carleton New York Regiment on the 13th of December. These are the soldiers that were killed on the 14th. On the 15th of December, was tried again. Once again, another frontal attack, but this time, General Vokes decided that the Carleton New York were going to receive some support from the Royal 22nd Regiment. We're going to try to do a left hook in from the left-hand side of Cider Crossroads, and in the area of Casa Berardi. And later in the battle, one of the members of the Vandus, Captain Trique, famously won a Victoria Cross in the actions at Casa Berardi. In addition to the Vandus, there was going to be some armored support in the form of tanks. They were going to try and do a left hook, fire onto the German positions around Cider Crossroads, as the Carleton York once again did another frontal towards the objective. There was some success on this one, but not as much as General Vokes had hoped. Once again, fairly heavy casualties, was certainly not as heavy as first day's fighting on the 13th. This is just a slide of the headstones of the Carleton York soldiers killed on the 15th of December. On the 18th of December, the Carleton York took more casualties. For the remainder of the battle to take the Cider Crossroads and the areas west of the town of Ortona, Carleton York had suffered some pretty heavy casualties, right? The unit took a lot of criticism from the division commander, General Vokes, and from some of the division staff. Vokes' complaint is that they didn't push the attack hard enough. You know, the answer to that from the chain of command of the Carleton York as well, you know, they'd suffered heavy casualties. They were exhausted. It was a hard objective. You know, all the normal things that, you know, we know are pretty, you know to be pretty obvious now. At the end of the day, after the 15th, the Carleton York Regiment was told to hold fast in the area of Cider Crossroads, which they did. But it was no real break. They were still under virtually constant German artillery fire. Additionally, they always had to put out patrols to keep, you know, make sure there was no enemy coming into their areas. Casualties were suffered again on the 18th from patrolling and from casualties due to artillery fire. 19 December, okay, very similar story. Okay, patrols going out and casualties were taken from artillery and casualties that happened during the patrols. 2 soldiers here killed on the 19th. December, by the time the 20th of December rolled around, the Carleton York Regiment had tried to move towards the east, towards Ortona, in the attempt to take out some German positions outside the town itself. Okay, the Germans had withdrawn at this point. One thing I forgot to mention earlier was partway through the battle for the Gully itself, the units of the 90th Panzer Grenadier Division had withdrawn, and 1st Fallschirmjäger Division units took over from them in the Gully positions and around Cider Crossroads. So there you had the Carleton York Regiment trying attack after attack, frontal attack into this really hard position, and partway through the attack on the attack of the 15th, they were facing fresh German soldiers new into the position. On the 20th, as I said, they would try to move forward into the outskirts of Ortona, again with some success, but by that time, the Germans were withdrawing into the town itself. By the 22nd of September, they were holding fast in their positions outside of Ortona to the west of the town. However, once again, they were still there on the front lines, conducting patrols, taking German artillery fire, and casualties were taken then as well. 25 September, they were still outside of the town of Ortona itself. The urban battle, which I should mention is going to be covered in great detail by a speaker next week, Major Jason Giroux. The urban battle for Ortona was going on all this time, right? So after the Germans pulled out of the Gully positions and the area around Cider Crossroads, they moved into the town itself. 1st and 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigades were the ones that took the fight into the streets of Ortona itself. The Carleton York Regiment maintained their positions outside of the town to the west. And on Christmas Day, 1943, suffered their last 2 casualties for this phase of the Ortona campaign. Now, I'm using Christmas Day as my cutoff point, and I know our subsequent speaker on the Ortona campaign, Major Giroux, he's probably going to start his talk, back it up a little bit from Christmas Day, and talk about the start of the urban fight into Ortona itself. On Christmas Day, 1943, the Carleton York were holding fast in their positions west of Ortona. Christmas dinner of sorts was made available to the troops. You know, sweets were brought up for them to have. A beer or 2 per man was brought up for them to have, even though they were basically still in a hasty defensive position on the front line. It was on Christmas Day that these 2 casualties occurred, both from artillery fire. In addition to the 2 casualties, there were several wounded, one of them being Lieutenant Lorne B. Groom. Lieutenant Groom was serving Christmas dinner to the soldiers of his platoon when an artillery shell landed nearby him, and he lost both legs. He survived the war, he survived his wounds, he was evacuated eventually back to Canada and led a successful life, becoming an eye doctor. He also, at one point after the war, became mayor of St. Stephen, New Brunswick. This slide here just shows some of the faces of some of the Carleton New York Regiment soldiers that were killed during the Battle of the Gully. This is just a few, obviously. These are the only images I could find of the casualties from that particular battle. Obviously, there was many more, but I just put this up there as a reminder that, you know, we talk about a lot of the facts and figures of battles, the conditions, you know, the shape of the ground, the friendly units, the enemy units, but at the end of the day, it all comes down to the human cost. And we see it here in the faces of these young men. Today, the Royal New Brunswick Regiment has a connection to the Battle of the Gully. Firstly, the battle honor, the Gully, being emblazoned on the regimental color of the Royal New Brunswick Regiment. And the second and more personal connection, I would say, to the soldiers of the unit is in 2011, the Junior Ranks Mess Committee put forward a motion to rename the Junior Ranks Mess the Gully. And then since 2011, that is the name of the Junior Ranks Mess in the Royal New Brunswick Regiment. It is known as the Gully. This was done in honor, and it was written in the mess minutes of the meeting where they okayed the change of the name. It was done in honor of the soldiers of the Carleton New York Regiment that fell at the Battle of the Gully on that terrible time in December 1943. That's it for my presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, David. Can everybody hear me? David, can you hear me, David?
I can.
Yep. Okay. And I'm assuming everybody else can. Okay. So I'm just going to just hang on there Thanks, Captain Hughes, for that informative presentation on the Battle of the Gully. Also to Major Scarp for his introduction of our speaker. Just like to say that Major Scarp is Vice President of the York-Sunbury Historical Society and an historian in his own right. So maybe we'll have him give a talk in this series sometime down the road. If you have a question, now is the time to ask. So let's start with the first question from Burridge. I'm not sure who Burridge's first name is, but it said, could you comment on the friendly fire casualties?
Yes, certainly, that did happen. That's a very true statement during the Battle of the Gully. The friendly fire occurred from what we call in the military as drop shorts, right? So friendly artillery going over the heads of the assaulting infantry to attempt to hit the enemy objective. On all of the frontal attacks that the Carleton York attempted in the Gully, they were supposed to closely follow a barrage, friendly barrage through the objective, right? On a few occasions, there were friendly fire casualties. I don't have the actual numbers in front of me on that right now, but I know of at least 2 occasions where friendly fire casualties occurred in the Carleton York Regiment.
There's another question in our chat from Brent Wilson, historian. What happened to the Carleton York prisoners?
Carleton York prisoners, I don't have the actual the written information on that in front of me. However, I don't think there was any atrocities in this case occurred where they were, purposely murdered by the Germans or anything. That certainly hasn't come up in any of my readings. And, the 28 soldiers were taken prisoner and I assume sent to the rear, to the German rear, and, were locked up back there with other POWs.
We have a question from Don Orth. He's asking, were the Canadians aware of the Gully from maps and other intelligence? It seems to me that they were somewhat surprised by this particular geographic feature.
Well, I mean, you're exactly right. They weren't surprised by it. I mean, obviously they knew it was there. They had maps. They had, at various stages prior to the battle, they had aerial reconnaissance. They knew it was there. They knew it was a formidable objective. And that fact makes General Vokes's decisions to make this like a 1 battalion frontal attack even more questionable. Because, as a lot of soldiers said, both during and after the war, that he kind of had a lot to answer for what happened at the Gully. And, you're exactly right. I mean, Don, your question is hits a nail on the head. If they knew this was such a hard position, why did they only attack it with 1 battalion at a time? And especially when you consider the other factors, no air support, hard to observe and put fire on the German objective because it was a reverse slope position, all those things. So it's, they knew it was there. They knew it was going to be a hard objective. However, they did their duty. They followed their orders and they went in on, several occasions trying to take this hard objective and weren't really able to fully do it.
I have another question. Thank you very much, Captain Hughes. I have another question. This is, hi all, I live in San Donato near Moro River. Was there any attack held by sea? This is Loris Lupinetti from Italy.
Wow. Hello in Italy. So the question was, were there any attacks from the sea?
Were there any attacks held by sea?
I
live in San Donato near Moro River. Was there any attack held by sea?
In my readings, no, not that I know of, but perhaps a naval historian would have a little more info on that. I don't believe there was, though.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I have another question from Charles Ferris. He was wondering, can you please provide us with a numerical context? What were the total numbers in the Carleton York Regiment, platoon, and breakdown of ranks?
Sure. Okay. So a platoon, for example, I'm just going to have kind of ballpark numbers here. A platoon, even through World War II, was always around 30 soldiers, commanded by a lieutenant. A company was a full company, a rifle company was around 120 soldiers, commanded by a major. Okay, and then going down below platoon level, you would have sections in each, 3 sections per platoon, generally commanded by a corporal back then. So when you look at the numbers that were lost, both through prisoners taken by the Germans from the Carleton York Regiment and the soldiers that were killed and wounded, they lost the better part of a full company from their strength.
So wondering if there are any other questions, you can send by chat, or you can raise your hand through the mic. Just I see Jim keeps on coming on, but perhaps Jim, did you want to ask a question, Jim? Yes. Okay.
Okay. So how were the prisoners of war treated? What did they do? What was the procedure when they captured some prisoners of war?
When the Canadians captured Germans, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they followed, they followed all the normal procedures, which was to, seize, secure, segregate, and speed to the rear, like the 4 S's. That was the process, right? So you would seize these prisoners, seize control of their weapons, take the weapons away from them, secure them. So, if they wouldn't have to be handcuffed or whatever, or tied, their hands tied, but just make sure they were secure under guard, for example. Segregate, so like segregate the officers away from the soldiers that were taken prisoner, so they couldn't organize any kind of escape. That was looked at as a way to kind of reduce the chances of them trying to organize some kind of resistance or escape. And then speed to the rear, which meant just to they would be moved to the rear lines of the Canadians and handed over to the military police. And the military police would then take them from there, and they'd be off to a prison war camp somewhere.
I think that was probably our last question. I'm just going to give you one more chance. Does anybody have another question to ask? And if not, I'll call this, we'll bring this presentation to a close, that being our final question. And I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight, and especially to Captain Hughes for making the first presentation in our virtual speaker series. And I want to remind everyone that next Thursday, November 19 at 7 p.m., Major Jason Giroux will be speaking live via Zoom on the urban battle for Ortona, one of the more unique battles in Canadian military history, which provides lessons and doctrinal formulas for modern armies. And we hope to see you again next week. If you have any questions, you can always contact us at the Fredericton Region Museum by email at frederictonregionmuseum@gmail.com, or phone us at 506-455-6041. Or you can also check out our website, www.frederictonregionmuseum.com, or our Facebook page for up-to-date information. So we'll see you next week. And I hope that you've enjoyed this first in our virtual presentation, which we had 33 participants. And I'm very pleased to have had you all here this evening, and we'll hope to see you again next week. So I'm going to call an end to this meeting, and it'll be recorded, and you can see it on YouTube when we make it live on the website. Thank you again to everybody, especially to Captain Hughes and Charles Ferris, Hal Scarab, Stephen Thomas, and next week we'll listen to Jason Giroux. Thank you. Bye-bye now.